delighted to have Chris Hopson here. I'm sure you all know Chris in his still relatively new role as Chief Strategy Officer for NHS England. Now, rather than have a conversation, I hope you know this, Chris, you're going to do a little bit of a preamble, excellent, in terms of delivering integration. So I think we've just been talking about the role of the centre.
Yep.
Here is the centre. Chris,
a small part of the centre, please.
Over to you, Chris.
Okay, so hello, my name is Chris Hopson. Actually, I'll stand up if I may so I can see you all. So hello, my name is Chris Hopson. As Richard has said, I'm Chief Strategy Officer for NHS England. Look, I thought it was really interesting, your conversation, Patricia and Claire. And one of the things that resonated with me is just this kind of sense of, we are some way along the journey, but we're still kind of relatively early on in the journey of really fully integrating care, but also the sense that it looks different in different places. And I just wondered if it might just be a bit of fun, really, to just kind of basically say, okay, so looking at what we can see in front of us in terms of where this is working well, are there some kind of underlying principles that we can bring out? I'm a bit of a list man. I love a list. So I've basically got a list of 7 things that I feel we can begin to see about the things that actually, where this is working, you can really see it's an underlying principle. Look, this is not definitive. This is certainly not the formal NHS England list, I should say. This is a bit of a Chris Hopson list. But I just thought it might be quite fun to just kind of run through the 7 things that I think we can see. The first is, I think, and again, I think, Patricia, this is a direct echo of something that you said, starting with need. Yep, quite often we start in the health service and in wider public service delivery, and let's make be absolutely clear, this isn't just about the NHS, it's not just about health, it's about health and care, and it's about partnerships. But quite often we start with existing pattern of provision as opposed to actually what's the need. And I think when you talk about the need, for me, 2 crucial elements. The data, what is the data telling you? Whole population health management approach of really understanding what is the need, but also alongside the data, really understanding what your citizens and your patients are telling you, which is where I think, as our colleague from Kent was saying, clearly local authorities have got a really important role to play. So that's the first bit, start with the need. The second bit I think we can see is people thinking in a much more flexible and different way about how do we need to redesign the delivery of care. You can call it the care pathways, call it what you want, to actually meet that need. Remembering as you do that process of redesign, the importance of putting patients and citizens right at the heart of that redesign, rather than us as the delivery professionals going off and kind of deciding what we think should kind of happen. The third element, which will appeal particularly to my friend Dr. Fuller, is effectively, I think she's absolutely put her finger on it when she says the centrality of those integrated multidisciplinary neighbourhood teams that actually cross organisational boundaries. And again, look, you'll all have your own examples, but I'm just incredibly struck as I go on my visits, which I think are the best part of my job, about how much those integrated multidisciplinary teams that actually cross the organisational boundaries, about how actually, where that is working really effectively, you can genuinely see things starting to shift. The fourth bit, which we probably, I think, haven't quite talked enough about maybe, is that I'm again very intrigued that when you do that pathway design, and in particular, when you have those integrated multidisciplinary neighbourhood teams, and they're really listening to patients and citizens, what comes out is the importance of access, triage, and navigation. What I think is really interesting is when you talk to our citizens and you talk to our users of health and care, they quite often, they don't know where to go. They're pointed in multiple kind of different places. And again, we'll all have our own examples, but I remember, visiting a team in Greenwich quite a long time ago who were actually really, really pioneering this idea of a kind of single point of access for those who absolutely kind of needed health and care services, really sophisticated thought being given to how do you triage, and then effectively really kind of very effective kind of redirection. So not actually kind of necessarily huge amounts of actual delivery of health and care, but actually navigation, access and triage. The fifth bit, and absolutely, and these are some more sort of moving into the enablers, is partnerships are just absolutely fundamental. And again, I'm incredibly struck by how, and again, first virtual visit I did when I started this job was a really interesting visit to Gloucestershire, where effectively really thinking in a very sophisticated way in that ICB about how you genuinely did join up in a partnership, not just with local authorities, but voluntary sector as well, and community sector, and a real kind of sense of not just those two, but also really listening carefully to communities, which doesn't necessarily mean listening and working just with local authorities and community groups, but actually thinking really quite carefully about how do you actually work with communities themselves. The sixth bit for me is it's as much a frame of mind as anything, is effectively thinking about, I think some of the really interesting things that are going on is people thinking about how do we make best use of the assets that we have available to us? Quite often, we have this real kind of sense of deficit thinking, what's kind of wrong, what's missing. But actually, again, in Gloucestershire, just to go back, I mean, really interesting about a really clear focus that in some of their more rural isolated communities, actually having a physical hub was absolutely central to the provision of effective support. And a real kind of sense, again, of thinking about, well, in some places that might be using an NHS facility, in some places that might be thinking about using a local authority facility. In some places, it actually might be, a voluntary sector or a community facility like, a village hall. And then the final bit, and I've deliberately put it at the end because quite often, sometimes we kind of think about some of these things first. And I would observe that for perfectly understandable reasons, we've done quite a lot of work on this in the first year of ICSs. Underpinning all of that, for me, is the right leadership, the right governance, the right financial measurement reporting arrangements. And yes, we have had to spend quite a lot of time setting up committee structures. But what's again really clear when you kind of go round is, yes, if you get those right, but see them as enablers rather than ends in themselves, actually, they can make a huge difference. And again, I would observe just, talking about the local authority NHS relationship, I think the reality that we need to acknowledge is in the English system, we still do have two separate governance structures, two separate financial structures. And, like it or not, quite rightly, in any public service, governance and the way the money flows are really, really important issues. But I'm really intrigued by the way when you go to some places, actually, despite that context, I think it's really interesting to see how people are creating some really interesting and innovative ways of saying, okay, we need to move beyond that. And actually, how do we create the right relationships and the right structures, the right financial flows to ensure that they underpin what we need to do here? So as I said, it's a bit of a parlour game, if you don't mind. Hopefully it's been a helpful parlour game. But those would be the sort of 7 things that, as I feel I go round, I can begin to see underpin the kind of movement towards, or the growing sense of, how do we integrate care?
Thank you, Chris.
Helpful, Richard.
Very, very helpful. Policy just flows from you. It's a wonder to see it. I mean, that's fantastic. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions on those 7 principles as well. I've got many, so I'm going to take chair's prerogative and start. What I really liked about that list, Chris, was how a lot of it flowed one from the other. So thinking about points 1 and 2 in particular, starting with need, you talked about not being trapped by that existing pattern of provision in terms of our thinking. And then you talked about that flexible thinking that's required on redesign. I think often in the NHS, we think we want to be radical, but actually we push the boundary a very little bit.
Yeah.
How do we all culturally start to both get the inspiration, the permission, but perhaps also, I suppose, the motivation to push those boundaries to the extent that they need to be pushed if we're really going to break out of this sense of the 1948 model of how we deliver care?
I think I'd be really tempted to say, trust the patient and citizen voice, trust the partnership, and trust the data. And if you start with the patient voice, citizen voice, and you start with the data, and you kind of start with, really doing a rigorous analysis of what's needed, I think in a sense there's a sort of almost inexorability that it basically pulls you towards doing things differently as opposed to the way they are done at the moment. And there's a sort of I don't know, there's sort of honesty, and honesty is probably the wrong word, but inexorability, that if you do that bit properly, then I think absolutely it will force you to, in a sense, kind of, be significantly more innovative than if you just say, well, look, this is what we do in an existing way. How can we improve this? How can we improve that? Actually, in a sense, I mean, I'm a great believer in the word picture of turning the telescope round. If you turn the telescope round and look at it through the other end, I think you get a very different picture, but also a very different, mindset of how you do business.
Yeah. And I don't want to bill you as a centre, but you are our best representative of the centre today. But from an NHS England perspective, what are the things that need to happen within the centre? What's that signal from the centre that gives people both the permission and the encouragement to move into that radical space? I mean, what is it we can do from that central position to really, I suppose, make a fertile ground for localities to really know that that's the direction of travel that they should take the steps towards?
Well, I mean, clearly, Patricia has set out really quite clearly some of the things that we need to do. Let me just sort of reel off three things that kind of come immediately. I mean, first is we need to give ICBs, ICSs, integrated care partners the space to lead. And we've been very specific that has been one of the very significant drivers between us wanting to create a new NHS England that looks very different from the current NHS England HE and NHS Digital kind of put together. So that would be, for me, would be the first bit. I think the second is a kind of, and I think, again, Patricia put it really, really well, which is it's inevitable that with a large, complex organisation like the NHS, you do tend to get silos. And, your point, Patricia, about, quite understandably, we have some incredibly brilliant people who are absolute world experts in their field. I think the real trick for all of us is actually about how we join all of that up in a effectively holistic, equally strong horizontal as well as some kind of strong verticals. And that's, again, something that we're thinking a lot about as we go through our kind of change process. Patricia was really clear that there were two other bits that are really important. One is the centre needs to join up, and effectively, I think that is really important in terms of being able to kind of have a single, consistent and coherent leadership approach that kind of comes from government, number 10, Treasury, and NHS England joining up. And I think the other thing that she flagged was the importance of being clear about a small number of priorities. Like it or not, the delivery of health and care does require us to do a very, very broad range of things. But we just do need to be clear about, setting a appropriately prioritised strategic framework, which we then give local ICSs the power to deliver within.
Thank you, Chris. I've got one more question about integration, but I'm also going to just ask the room. So, Ros, if you've got some people, and also, can I just mention for those online, we do have Arlene as your champion, your voice in the room. So if you do have questions online, please do put them in the chat, and Arlene will be your representative today. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chris. Nice to meet you, and thank you, speakers. Appreciate it. It's fascinating today. My name is Dr. Dean Eggett. I'm a GP in Doncaster, South Yorkshire. I work for the local medical committee. From your
He's happy.
He's right. Whatever he says, he's right.
So you said you like list. I'm going to give you some statistics, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Last year, I've been looking at integrated care. So NHS England has published online over the past 10 years, 654 documents. Out of those 654 documents, 41 of them are related to integration strategies, in particular related to primary care. That's 1,493 pages of strategy. When you go through those, you can actually extrapolate around 356 individual policy points of integration of primary care. And those policy points can be very small or they can be huge. Now, when you map those, approximately 230 are about organisational change of general practice and primary care. 0 are for patient incentives to address how they use the NHS. When are we going to start talking about patients using the NHS rather than asking GPs to organise and change?
So I don't know about all of you, but I found the debate around the 75th really very interesting. And I think there have been a number of kind of key points that have come out. One for me is that fundamental underlying kind of commitment to the underlying principles of the NHS. But I think what's also kind of come out is a recognition that the relationship that we have as a service with our citizens, I think I prefer to say citizens at this point rather than patients, we need to think really carefully about what does that relationship look like going forward. And it probably needs to be a more a relationship in which we think about how do we enable and support our citizens to look after their health and their own well-being more effectively. We in the NHS have clearly got some, secondary prevention responsibilities around, particularly cardiovascular, a whole bunch of kind of different things. But there is also something. I mean, we are I think it's the second most obese nation in Europe. We have clearly got a set of issues around ill health where some of this is government's responsibility, but some of it is also our citizens' responsibility. And we need to work out how we can support them to effectively lead longer and healthier lives. I remain absolutely fascinated by the way in which if I had my phone here, I would hold it up and say, this is potentially the single most important tool that we've got to enable us to do that more. But that's a great way for me in which, the modern technology, there are some other interesting stuff kind of coming through in 21st century medicine, but the modern technology offers us the real potential to completely change that relationship between us and the NHS and our citizens in terms of looking after their own health and well-being. So if your basic point is, do we need to look at that? My answer would be yes. The NHS Assembly report that was produced about 3 or 4 weeks ago as the NHS Assembly contribution to the 75th, I thought brought that out really effectively.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you for that. We're going to have a couple more questions. Before we do, I'm also going to I'm sorry, we are going to run out of time here, but Chris, I must just push you on the integration piece because we talked a lot about health and local authorities. And because we've been talking about the great county of Yorkshire, just a quick example. So in South Yorkshire, our Metro Mayor, Oliver, chairs our integrated care partnership. So we have that democratic representation on that. I conversely chair the local enterprise partnership, so I look after the economic growth piece. I think we don't talk enough about the wider integration of place in terms of health rather than health delivery. So we talk an awful lot about good health, good jobs, education, transport, and its relationship with health. How do we get our integration agenda to think more broadly about that real partnership rather than just the healthcare access?
Well, there's no doubt, in my view, that I think one of the fantastic opportunities of integrated care systems is we're creating a structure which enables that dialogue and that debate to happen in a way which it probably hasn't before. But the structure by itself is kind of not enough. In my view, it kind of requires leaders, but also, frontline service deliverers who are absolutely wanting to use that structure and have got the frame of mind of using the structure to actually, build those kind of partnerships in a really effective way. And in the places where this is happening, you can absolutely see in front of your eyes, you can see leaders behaving differently. You can see them redesigning pathways. You can see things changing and happening. But it's because, people are actually kind of changing what they do day to day and making a conscious effort to do so rather than actually saying, let's recognizing the challenge and the pressure we are under, let's kind of carry on doing what we're doing and doing the best within the existing way of delivering.
Chris, thank you. And apologies, I don't think we're going to have time because we know we've got Habib waiting online and he'll be waiting patiently for us to join him. So apologies that was brief, but I'm sure you'll agree it was well worth listening to. Can I ask you to thank Chris in the usual way?
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.